Hello everyone, welcome back to our SBD series. My name is still Walid Al-Morsi and I'm still working with the Microsoft Information Protection Customer Acceleration team. Today we are starting episode number 2 of our SBD series, so let's get started. For our today's agenda, we will start by reviewing the episode 1 topics that we discussed last time, and then we will move on to the data discovery and risk analysis topic, which is a very important topic, followed by the classification taxonomy or the classification scheme that we came up with as a result of the risk analysis, as we will see later in this session. And then we'll end by going through the information retention and records management topic. All right, let's review what we've discussed in the first episode. Obviously, we started with the SBD series introduction, including objectives and the plot, and we ended that part with reviewing the requirements of the SBD series. And then we explored the data classification topic, including the data classification framework, or what we call the DCF, recommended practices as well, and gave some examples. And then we finished the session talking about the data governance, including the framework and the recommended practices. If you haven't watched episode 1, please make sure you do before continuing watching this episode. All right, data discovery and risk analysis. So what is data discovery and risk analysis? Well, it's an integral part of the information protection and compliance strategy. In fact, it's the first major blocker in your journey. This phase is called Know Your Data, and it's one of the 3 pillars that Microsoft Information Protection, or MIP, is built on. The objective here is to surface the hidden compliance and confidentiality and information privacy risks related to the existing data within the organization. By doing so, we will solve the dark data problem by getting out of the box insights into our sensitive data, where it lives, what kind of data it is, and how it's being used and shared. We will leverage a couple of M365 tools and services, not all of them, later in the series in an automated way that will discover data that is stored in Microsoft Cloud and on-premises file shares. Then analyze it to check if there may be any compliance risk to our organization. Next, we will have a sneak peek on one of the tools, which we call it Content Explorer, or CE, in the Microsoft 365 compliance portal. Let's have a look. So what did we discover with regards to our information in the cloud? Well, here we can see that the Content Explorer tool in our SBD demo tenant is giving us lots of insights. In fact, too much insights if you have the right permission about our existing data in the tenant. So we logged into the M365 compliance portal in our SBD tenant. And then under data classification, we can see a high-level overview on SITs, which is sensitive information types, if you recall, that are most used with our existing data in the cloud. Here is a little more detailed breakdown of the specific SITs that we found in our demo tenant, including the number of objects, where an object could be a document or an email that contains sensitive information type. Let's have a closer look on the first one in the list, where the credit card number SIT appeared in 69 times in our information. Here we can see that there are 16 email messages contain credit card number information, and we have 41 and 12 documents in OneDrive for Business and SharePoint Online, respectively, also contain credit card number information. Later in the series, we will go into more details about Content Explorer, as well as the AIP scanner, which is the other discovery tool that we mentioned in the previous slide. For now, the purpose of showing you what sensitive information types currently exist in our tenant will be explained in the next few slides. As we noticed in the previous slide, when we had a sneak peek on the Content Explorer in our SBD tenant, we noticed lots of different information types exist in our tenant. For example, we have Australian driver license number, we have US passport numbers, etc., as you can see on the screen. So let's have a closer look on the types of data we discovered and the risks associated if it was leaked or compromised to reinforce their significance. First of all, the financial impact, which is undoubtedly one of the most immediate and hard-hitting consequences that organizations will have to deal with. Costs can include compensating affected customers, setting up incident response efforts, investigating the breach, investment into new security measures, and legal fees. Now, not to mention the regulatory penalties that can be imposed by being non-compliant, as we will see in the next slide. Number two, you have legal consequences. Organizations are legally bound to demonstrate that they have taken all the necessary steps to protect personal data under data protection regulations. If this data is compromised, whether it's intentional or not, individuals can seek legal action to claim compensation. Number three, when it comes to risk associated, is reputational damage. For example, customers in retail or finance or healthcare will stop doing business with organizations that have been breached or compromised. Additionally, some customers will tell others about their experience, and some of them will take it to the social media to vent their anger. So imagine the reputational damage that can occur to the organization. Number four, the operational downtime. Business operations will often be heavily disrupted in the aftermath of the data breach. Organizations will need to contain the breach and conduct a thorough investigation into how it occurred. Operations may need to be completely shut down until investigators get all the answers they need. This process can take days, even weeks, depending on the severity of the breach. This can have a huge negative effect on revenue and an organization's ability to recover. Now, on top of the discover sensitive data or sensitive information that we observed in the previous couple of slides through the Content Explorer, there are some additional data that we need to protect, such as intellectual property, IP, which is mainly our COVID-19 research data. Some competition information, such as marketing plans, business plans, pricing, etc. And any information that is an interest of regulatory bodies like privacy, etc. We have listed the regulatory frameworks and standards that we must comply with. This will be helpful in the upcoming sessions, especially when we start implementing security controls and data leakage protection. Now, let's talk about the data breach risk assessment for a few minutes. This is a very important and rather complex topic. It is crucial to mention before we start that this is by no means is the best or the only way to conduct a risk assessment for data breach. This is just a very high-level overview on some definitions and the approach to perform such a task. Also to highlight the importance and significance of this topic. When we conduct a data breach risk assessment, which is by far more complex than we are going to discuss today, as we mentioned, we have to first identify data breach. In very simple terms, data breach occurs when personal or sensitive information is lost or subjected to unauthorized access, modification, use, or disclosure, or any other misuse. Risk assessment is the compilation of risks associated with various potential threat events. A threat event is any event which may cause a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information or data. Let's give examples of some threat events that may cause a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. The first example there, when we have sensitive data compromised by external hacker or accessed by non-authorized personnel. This ultimately violates sensitive data confidentiality. The second example that we have when sensitive data is incomplete or incorrect or being altered in any way, shape, or form. This ultimately violates the data integrity. The last example that we have when sensitive data is no longer exist or no longer available. It could be lost, it could be encrypted, and we don't have the key, cannot be retrieved, cannot be searched. This ultimately violates the sensitive data availability. In order to identify risks, you want to think of as many threat events that may cause harm or damage as you can. The idea behind this is to get different views. A brainstorming session with multiple teams or departments will help. The list that you develop is going to be the foundation of the risk assessment matrix. Obviously, depending on your scope, the list needs to be long and detailed. It is important that you think of all potential risks for any threat event may cause. Now, moving on to risk levels. Well, risk levels are calculated as the product of the likelihood and the significance to the organization of a potential threat event. Likelihood is the probability of the risk occurring due to the threat event, as we discussed before, where the significance is the amount of damage or harm a threat event could create. Now, if you look closely to the likelihood table on the left-hand side, you can see that we sorted the probability from the very likely to occur on the top all the way down to the very unlikely to occur. And we give each level or each probability a score. For example, the very likely to happen will have a score of 5. Very unlikely, though, will have 1, which we assume there is no chance of this event to occur. On the right-hand side, for the significance table, we sorted the impact from negligible on the top, which is indicate that this event will have a negligible harm or adverse, all the way down to a catastrophic sort of consequences when these threat events occur. Again, you can sort them from high to low or low to high, whatever you feel like. And also you give them a score, or you give a score to each impact level. Let's give an example to make it more clear. Now, we've got a file or an Excel sheet in this case that contains US patient's driver license number, along with other PII information such as name, address, gender, etc. The file is mainly used to identify COVID-19 research applicants. The file was created by the HR department and was uploaded to their internal SharePoint Online site. The file currently is not labeled or encrypted. Also, access to the HR site is not controlled by any access control list. So basically, anyone can browse the website, can get into that site, and can view or access that file. So basically, in a situation where an internal user was searching the intranet and came across this file, or even worse, was looking for it, we can download, copy, edit, encrypt, share the file easily with no restrictions whatsoever. And that is an internal user. Let alone if a hacker got in, they can get their hands on the file, the situation can actually get worse. So it's very likely to happen. That's why we chose the likely option under likelihood. As you may expect, the significance here is catastrophic. Not only that we risk our reputation, pay compensation to those who were affected, we will also be fined for not complying with the various regulatory frameworks that we are supposed to comply with when it comes to information privacy for the citizens that we hold information. So using this simple risk assessment matrix, we can multiply the score for the likelihood that we came up with and the significance. So multiplying 4 by 5, that we can see the risk score for this specific threat is high, which may indicate that additional protection controls must be applied to protect this type of sensitive data. Now we know what types of information that we have in our tenant and where are they located. Let's move on and try to categorize these types in order to be able to classify them. So in order to classify our information, we need to categorize them. As you can see, we have categorized all of our information based on our discovery work and then the risk assessment that we perform against all sorts of information types that we have. So the first category that we have is the public information category, which includes all the information that can be used by everyone inside or outside the org and can be shared with anyone inside and outside the organization. An example of this sort of information is an approved published research or a media release. We have decided to only apply visual marking to a document or an email that contains this public information type of data. The second category is the general category, which basically includes information about our internal business, which is not meant to be publicly consumed. This information can be used by all employees and also can be shared with authorized customers and business partners as needed. An example of this information can be a non-sensitive business content. We have decided to only apply visual marking as well, which means we don't apply any encryption or control access to this general information. The third category is the confidential information category, which basically includes two sorts of confidential information within our tenant. The first one is the recipients only, which basically includes data about our sensitive business information. And this sensitive business information meant to be consumed based on a need to know basis, which could be internal or external parties as well, as long as it's a need to know basis. An example of this information that could be shared with external institutions, such as research results or any result that doesn't contain PII information, etc. We have decided to also continue applying visual marking on this sort of data. This time, we decided to apply encryption as well as non-forward, non-print, cannot remove encryption sort of controls to be able to ensure this sort of data cannot be leaked beyond whoever received it in the first place. The second level of the confidential data that we have is the internal only information, which basically includes sensitive business information that is not meant to be accessed by anyone other than internal employees. Because exporting this data to unauthorized users may cause damage to the business. Example of this internal only information could be internal company policies or employee information, contract, sales, or account data. Those only meant to be accessed by internal employees. So we have decided to apply visual marking as well as encryption, but we haven't configured any access controls on this sort of data. Moving on to the highest and the last category that we have, which is highly confidential, which basically includes highly sensitive information for the business. Exposing secret data to unauthorized users may cause serious damage to the business. And again, go back to the risk assessment example that we gave. We have different level of damage that can be caused. What sort of data that we have that falls under highly confidential? Well, any COVID research or project related information that we have, which includes participants' PII, financials, health records, etc., etc. So those are a very highly sensitive information to our institution. So we have decided to apply visual marking as well as encryption and control the access or control the information by non-forward, non-print, cannot remove encryption sort of controls. We just need to make sure whoever receives this cannot take it further or forward it on or print it or leak it or etc. etc. We need to have the tightest control possible on this sort of information. On top of the content classification that we just went through, there is also a concept of a container classification. What is container? The container is basically a SharePoint site or a team site or any location that contains or can store data. So basically, by classifying or labeling a container, we have a first line of defense to control access to that site, let alone accessing the data itself or the content itself. So we came up with a structure or a taxonomy for the containers labels as well. The first sort of category for that container is the public container. As we discussed in the previous slide, the public information can be accessed by anyone and shared with anyone. Also, the public container that can be accessed and published by anyone inside or outside the org. We have decided to just keep this site open. There is no control whatsoever. You can include external guests into it. Site content can be shared with no restriction. Everyone can access from anywhere, whether it's unmanaged device or an app or a browser, etc. Basically, it's public. It's meant to serve that specific situation where we can share public information. The second container category is the general. Again, that contains the information for the internet business that not meant for public consumption. That again follows the same taxonomy for the content itself. And we have decided to give adding external guests permission to only the owners. So if you are a member of the site, you cannot basically invite or add any external guest. The site content can be shared with guests and everyone can access it from any device and any app. So basically the main difference there is that external access only controlled by the site owner, which could be like SharePoint site owner or a team site owner. A regular member cannot add an external guest. The third container category is basically for confidential information. So we have similar restrictions as well, following from the general one. Only this time the privacy setting for this site is private. So basically only users can be added by invitations and only admins or owners can add members, right? External users are allowed to access this sort of sites, but only through a web browser. So if they are using, let's see, Teams application or Windows application, or even on the phone or the mobile, they cannot access this sort of sites. They have to go through the web browser only, because we can apply heaps of controls like limiting the download, limiting the print screen, etc., through the browser. So this is one of the methodology or the controls that we can apply to protect this confidential information. The fourth or the last category of sites or containers is the highly confidential ones, which basically includes all the highly confidential data. Again, it's a private site. Only owners can add members this time. So even if you're a member, you cannot add anyone, even if they are an internal user, not only external, as we said before, also internal, cannot be added by other internal users. Site content can be shared only with internal. So if you are trying to share a document from that highly confidential site to an external recipient, it will be blocked. Internal users can access it from only managed devices. So if you have an Intune managed device, etc., you are allowed to access this sort of information or sites. Otherwise, you will not be able to access. And we disabled external access to these sites altogether, so they are not allowed to access. Now we're done with the classification taxonomy for both content and container. Let's move on to the next section.
Thanks, Waleed. Again, welcome back to the SBD series. My name is Brendan Lee, and I'm going to discuss information governance. Now, as we discussed in our first video, information governance is all about limiting risk while meeting regulatory compliance. For that reason, we need to identify which regulations we must adhere to. These regulations could be related to our industry, which in this scenario is healthcare, but also could be related to the regions of the world in which we do business or where our employees reside. For example, an employer residing in Europe may have very different data residency and retention requirements than an employee in the United States. Now, as a quick reminder and disclaimer, this scenario involves a fictitious company, and we're dealing with real-world requirements and configurations. However, this video should not be used as a reference for actual regional industry-related or other regulations. Your organization should work with your information governance and legal teams to identify which regulations apply to your organizations. Then use this video series as a reference of how you can use Microsoft Information Governance to meet your regulatory needs. Now, with that out of the way, let's cover the plan that we've come up with for information governance. I mentioned before that we can use retention policies as a blanket policy, sort of like an organizational-wide default policy. From a risk perspective, we know that we want to keep things for only as long as they're useful, then dispose of them once they're no longer useful. This is a good information governance practice to reduce our digital footprint, as well as reduce risk in the event of a hack, litigation, or other potential problem. So along those lines, we're going to have Microsoft 365 retention policies that apply to our core workloads: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. Now, we plan to retain Exchange and Teams channel content for 1 year, then dispose of it. That'll allow a good balance between keeping enough information as to not hinder productivity while keeping long-term risk low. Documents usually have a slightly longer useful period. So for SharePoint and OneDrive content, we want to retain for 2 years based on the last modified date before disposing. Then finally, Teams one-on-one chat messages. This type of content is usually mostly unstructured conversations and can sometimes pose more of a liability by keeping them around. So we want to mitigate that potential risk by enforcing deletion after 90 days. Now, what about content that we need to keep longer for regulatory, record, and other reasons? We can use retention labels for this. We'll use a two-pronged approach: auto-label policies to label content that could be identified automatically based on sensitive information types, KQL queries, and even trainable classifiers. Then we'll also provide labels that users can manually apply to mark items as records, extend retention periods, etc. So let's discuss some of the labels we'll start out with. We want to create a baseline of labels for now that provide additional functionality over the default retention policies we've previously talked about. And then we can add labels over time as needed, such as if additional regulations apply to us in the future. One of the scenarios we'd like to solve with a label is extending the retention period. Maybe there's a certain document or email that needs to be retained for longer than we allow with our default retention policies. We want to make sure that we still keep in mind risk aversion, so we provide both a 5 and 7 year label that automatically deletes after the retention period. This will allow our users to extend any document or email's retention for up to 7 years from when the item was created, or for documents 5 years from when it was last modified. Next, we want to make sure that we have a label in place for records. We mentioned before that records are vitally important as they serve as immutable memories of a business. We need to be able to keep these records for 10 years from the creation date, but before we delete them, we want to initiate a review process called disposition review, which will allow our records managers to confirm the item is ready for a deletion or decide to extend the retention if necessary. Then we need to have labels that can apply to our most sensitive content: research data, including findings from our studies, and personal identifiable information, such as participant contact information. This will allow us to conform to industry regulations, such as keeping health records for a maximum of, say, 6 years, and regional regulations, such as keeping PII for a maximum of 3 years. As we continue to grow, expand, and evolve as an organization, we may encounter additional or different requirements, and that's okay. The Compliance Center makes it super easy to add to our file plan as regulations and business needs change.
Thanks, Brendan. Now, before we close out this episode, let's quickly go over the SBD requirements one more time to see if we have any updates and whether we managed to address any of the listed requirements. The main requirement that we managed to address after the first 2 episodes is the assist with developing an information protection and governance strategy including classification scheme requirement. As now we know what data we have and where it is located, we can pretty much start protecting and governing it with a clear written policy. With that said, addressing the information protection and governance strategy policy will lead the way and enable us to start addressing the remaining of the requirements. As an example, we cannot really determine and apply information retention on restricted information without first knowing what it is and where it is located. Same goes for protecting information while sharing with external parties or granting access to authorized users. The classification scheme is vital to determine the sensitivity of the information and the protection controls that must go with it after performing the appropriate risk assessment, as we discussed earlier.
Welcome back! Thank you for watching so far, and I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to watch our next videos in this great scenario-based demo video series that we prepared just for you. Also, make sure to check out our one-stop shop resource page that we prepared just for you that contains all our resources from the MIP CXE team. That's at aka.ms/MIPC/OSS. Thank you, and see you on our next videos.